Continuing with section 5, just to be clear, I'm here on page 205. He says something else which is, I think, helps to understand what he's getting at by the first line about the specifically human problem of death being being a result of the transformation of the living being into person, or at least a related thought, and that's right here, where he says that death comes from an alien sphere and is introduced, as it were, from outside into our existence. Well, that I think is a very important thought too. And one of the things I was getting at in the first of this week's essays, or videos, excuse me, death is natural for a living being, but is death natural for a person? We can say that every living being, in a certain sense, is supposed to die. Hans Jonas gave us reasons for that. But is a person supposed to die? I think that Landsberg is kind of giving us a definite answer here. When he says that death comes from an alien sphere, that is, death is not something natural to us, it's something alien to us. And is introduced from outside into our existence. That is, you could say that as Hans Jonas says, in terms of being biological creatures, organisms, death is part of the constitution. The possibility of death is built into life. So it's natural. It's death comes from within life, I think Jonas would say. And here, Landsberg is saying that once we understand what a person is as opposed to an organism, true individual, unique personality, death is not something that is natural to coming from within the existence of that person. It's something that's introduced from the outside. It is, in fact, the enemy. And so, if we could go to page 206, one of the things that Jonas has in mind is that he is arguing against Heidegger's existentialist view of death, which I think is quite an important thing to realize here. And this is made explicit at the top of page 206 when he says this: the human person, I'm right about right here, the human person is not, in its true essence, an existence towards death. And that is the Heidegger idea, that human existence is, in essence, an existence towards death. That was perhaps the biggest, most challenging idea that emerges from Glenn Gray's essay on the idea of death and existentialism. And here, Landsberg is specifically rejecting. The human person is not, in its true essence, an existence towards death. That Heidegger totally misunderstood human existence, or the person's existence. So Landsberg continues after that striking saying, like every other existence, after its own fashion, it is a movement towards self-realization and towards eternity. Now here, I think Landsberg's Catholicism comes to the fore. The notion that this is very much, I think, I know that he was a big St. Augustine scholar, but I'm not as familiar with Augustine as I am Thomas Aquinas, and it reminds me of very Thomistic, Thomas Aquinas-like idea of existence moving towards its own end or purpose, which is an idea that comes ultimately from Aristotle, I suppose. It tends towards its own perfection. That is, every existing thing tends towards its own perfection, even if this means passing through the straight and narrow gate of death. And here we do get an idea of his overall outlook, and that is that the human person is not a being towards death. It's a being to something beyond death. That is, we all realize that we have to die, but whereas the existentialist view, which is essentially an Epicurean view, says that, This is the existentialist view. I mean, human existence is an existence towards death. Thinking of it as a boundary experience, death is the ultimate limit and boundary. So that human existence might sound kind of dramatic or something, but it's an existence towards its own nothingness if death is where we become nothing. So if that's generally the existentialism that Heidegger was promoting, we could distinguish Landsberg's view of death. He never uses this expression, but it's something that I found helpful in trying to make sense of his philosophy. For Landsberg, human existence is a being beyond death. That is, the human person seeks its own fulfillment like every other thing. But its fulfillment, its true fulfillment, can only come, as he says, it tends towards its own perfection, even if this means passing through the straight and narrow gate of death. And here there is something reminiscent of Socrates' idea that the philosopher only really gets what they want after death. That is, death is a kind of fulfillment. Except that this is an explicitly theological view from Landsberg. That is, if you think about what the ultimate goal of every Christian is, I suppose, it's to perfect their own relationship with God, and that can only happen after death. I suppose that's the Christian background here. What I want to make clear is that Landsberg, in this train of thought here, where he says that death is something foreign to us, alien, and so cannot be a central part of our existence, that we are rather something, the human being, the human person, is something that looks forward to something beyond death. And he characterizes Epicureanism or existentialism, at least the atheistic existentialism that we've been looking at. Here, he says the finality of death is only felt as suffering when the act which would have pointed towards survival and eternity has been swallowed up in despair. The anguish of death, and not only the pain of dying, would be incomprehensible if the fundamental structure of our being did not include the existential postulate of something beyond. So you could say that Heidegger looks at human existence, the human condition, the structure of human existence, and Landsberg looks at it, and they see different things. Heidegger sees an existence heading towards nothingness. That's built into our existence. Landsberg sees an existence headed towards its own fulfillment, which is only one that could be actualized beyond death. And it's interesting how he characterizes his opponent here. He says, without this, that is, without this postulate of a something beyond, death would simply be a future fact, painful enough, no doubt, but without any exceptional gravity and without any danger of a metaphysical character. This is explaining why he characterizes death as a threat and menace. If it weren't that the postulate of eternal life were built into my existence, then death, which does seek to wipe me out, would not be problematic. It would not be. It wouldn't be something very important, as he says. Wouldn't be something of exceptional gravity unless I felt that as a person I should survive death. Then death would not be really such a big deal. The problematic aspect is, as a person, I feel like I should survive death in order to realize myself, become what I was meant to be. But death is this thing which says, no, you can't be it. I'm going to end you, not just your body, but your personhood. So that's why death becomes really, really important, especially for the Christian, who is the person that Landsberg sees as the person who has realized their individuality to the furthest extent. They're the most aware of the threat of death. This very anguish, it continues, reveals that death and nothingness are opposed to the deepest and most ineradicable tendencies of our being. Total rejection of the metaphysics of nothingness that Glenn Gray described in Existentialism. We are not speaking here of the instinct to duration, inherent in life in general, of Schopenhauer's will to live. At the very moment that I formulate the thought, I affirm the instinct in the human person to realize and perpetuate itself. At the root of all being, there is an act, the affirmation of the self. That's interesting that that's very similar to what Hans Jonas said. In each personality, aware of its uniqueness, we find the affirmation of this uniqueness, moving towards its realization, an affirmation which implies the tendency to surpass the limits of time. So, right, I mean, this is really interesting stuff, and he's laying out his position as somebody who's saying, well, the postulate of eternal life is built into human existence. The idea that the human person survives death, not only survives, but through the survival of death, through reaching the beyond, becomes what it was always meant to be. Landsberg just sees that written into our nature. And how does he characterize the opposite position? He says, faith in a personal survival is not merely a comforting thought. It is above all the expression, the actual shape given to this ontological factor. That is, I don't understand what he means by the ontological factor, really, but the hope for eternal life is not just a comforting thought. It's not just something to make us feel better. It's an expression of our deepest nature. On the other hand, right, death considered as finality, physical death considered as the universal negation of our existence. That is, death considered as not just the end of the body, but of the person itself. In other words, Epicureanism is only the reflection of a despairing unbelief, a negation of the person by the person. So, very, very striking thing to say. That is, the belief in Epicureanism, the belief that death is the absolute end and annihilation of the person as a whole, is, according to Landsberg, a kind of choice of despair, a kind of choice by the person to negate the person, a kind of a willful or voluntary falling into hopelessness. Quite something. And very, very Christian, very Catholic.